Welcome to the second lecture in this fall's Public Affairs Speaker Series. Its title for today's lecture is Facts Still Matter, Countering the Influence of Russian Hackers, Trolls, and Viral Deception, featuring Professor Kathleen Hall Jamieson. This talk is also part of the 20th anniversary celebration of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics. In the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, our center embraces political independence and education as the building blocks of justice and democracy. We encourage civic engagement and dialogue by bringing students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and community members together to discuss issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and our world. We are grateful to our co-sponsor for this talk, the university's Center for Science Communication Research. It is also made possible in part by the Richard W. and Lori Johnston Lecture Fund. We're especially grateful to members of the Wayne Moore Circle. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations, small, medium, and large. Please consider becoming a Wayne Moore Circle member with a donation of any amount. As part of our anniversary celebration this month, we're holding a special online fundraiser. Today, Ann and Dave Fidanki have pledged $1,000 if we get 10 new donations. To help us unlock this generous gift, please go to the waynemoorecenter.uoregon.edu for the link to the fundraiser and to check out the next speaker in our anniversary series. Finally, I want to welcome Wayne Moore scholar Emily Fowler, who will introduce our speaker. Emily is a senior majoring in political science and media studies, and she's doing an honors thesis this year that explores the role of artificial intelligence in elections. So Emily, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. I speak for everyone involved at the Wayne Moore Center that we are absolutely thrilled to host Professor Kathleen Hall Jamieson as part of the center's 20th anniversary celebration. Her topic could not be timelier or more urgent with the election just days away. Kathleen Hall Jamieson is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication and also director of the university's Annenberg Public Policy Center. She has co-authored or authored 16 books, including Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, which won the Association of American Publishers 2019 R.R. Hawkins Award and was published by the Oxford University Press. Among her other award-winning books are Spiral of Cynicism and The Obama Victory, How Media, Money, and Message Shaped the 2008 election. In 2003, Professor Jamieson co-founded factcheck.org, the nonprofit and nonpartisan website that describes itself as a consumer advocate for voters that aims to reduce the level of deception and confusion in US politics. FactCheck is a 10-time Webby Award winner for the best international politics website. And in 2020, the National Academy of Sciences awarded Professor Jamieson the Public Welfare Medal, its most prestigious honor. The Academy commended her for an exceptional nonpartisan crusade to ensure the integrity of facts and public discourse and development of the science and scientific communication to promote public understanding of complex issues. Professor Jamieson is also a member of the American Philosophical Society, the National Academy of Sciences, and a distinguished scholar of the National Communication Association. For her contributions to the study of political communication, she received the American Political Science Association's Murray Edelman Distinguished Career Award in 1995, and in 2016, the American Philosophical Society awarded her its Henry Allen Moe Prize in the Humanities. Professor Jamieson will speak for about 45 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. Please submit your questions via the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And questions won't be visible to the audience, but center staff will be collecting them, and we will attempt to get through as many as possible by the end of the lecture. So without further ado, please give a round of applause for Professor Jamieson. Welcome, and thank you so much for speaking today.
It's good to be with you, Emily, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'd like to start in advance by saying we've had some storms on the East Coast. If the internet goes out, I'm still going to be with you in spirit. Gary, who is helping me with technologies in another location, that's my backup. So if for some reason I disappear, Gary has been working with me for years, may just have to pick up the lecture. Let me start by saying that I look forward to seeing you last spring, and then the pandemic happened, and have been looking forward to seeing you in fall because I was a real fan of Wayne Morris and very much admire the work that you do in his name. What I'd like to do today is just start out by laying down some presuppositions. The first is you'll see in the title of the talk that I have the words viral deception. I have that there because I'd like to banish the concept of fake news from our vocabulary. You'll see major pieces of scholarship that have in their title fake news. You hear political leaders saying that's fake news. You even hear journalists occasionally talking about fake news. I'd like to start by arguing that if news is news, it can't be fake. If by news you mean journalism, journalism by definition, at least by my definition, corrects when it makes a mistake and the mistake is pointed out. It's inherently self-corrective, and it's transparent about that correction process when it's doing its job and adhering to that journalistic norm. So if when a mistake is pointed out, it corrects, it can't be fake news. Fake news is an oxymoron. And when you say fake news, you actually are delegitimizing news and with it journalism, and hence the structure built into our republic that holds elected officials accountable and is also supposed to be the custodian of what we can reasonably know that is consequential to us. So I'm going to use viral deception to talk about the troll posts in social media. That's the Russian cyber warriors who pretended they were us in 2016 and are still doing the same. And in the process, amplified content largely that was already found inside the US media structure. But in the process, they did insinuate some deceptions. And when those deceptions begin to traffic within like-minded communities, they go viral, in other words. I'd like to call that viral deception, not fake news, viral deception. And my acronym for that is VD, as in venereal disease, because I want you to think, oh, VD, well, I don't want to catch VD. I don't want to give anybody VD. And if I see it, I want to see it quarantined. So I want to take the negative affect, and you're at a university with the leading scholar of the affect heuristic in the globe. I'd like to take the affect attached to VD and attach it to viral deception so that when you see it or hear about it, your response is one of disgust. You just don't want to be near it. And when I'm talking about a troll, an imposter, pretending to be a news journalist, pretending to be part of a news site, and the news site isn't real, it isn't what it's pretending to be, but it's appropriated the identity of news. So its masthead looks like news, its type font looks like news, its structure looks like news. I want to call that imposter news, because the word I want you to hear is imposter. And I'm going to argue to you that one of the things those Russian trolls continued to do into this last few month period is put imposter news sites into the US structures in an attempt to use them to deceive us. Now, a few of them were caught and a few of them were taken down, but we need to watch for any others that are lurking there about to be activated on election day. So I want to start, in other words, by clarifying my terms. When I'm talking about viral deception, I mean the organic troll content that is deceptive. It's fundamentally misleading because they're pretending to be someone they're not, and that is a deception. Now, the platforms call that inauthentic content. I'm not going to use that phrase. I'm just going to call that viral deception. And their first deception is pretending they're somebody who's not. Now, why does that matter? It matters because we judge messages by source. And if the source appears to be like us, we're more likely to accept the content. And importantly, when we pick that content up and then we relay it, we share it, we've attached our own identity to it. So I want us to pay attention to the deception, which is pretending to be someone you're not. And I don't want us to put our identity behind it, thereby giving it the additional credibility that we carry as individuals to our friends who see our name attached and as a result are more likely to accept the content. So with that definitional landscape in the background, I only need to define one more term. When I talk about Russian hacking, what I mean in the context of 2016 is illegally breaking into computer structures in order to abstract, in this case in 2016, democratic content, and then releasing it into journalism by posting it online through WikiLeaks, a site run by Julian Assange. And that's going to be important in a moment because that hack and release structure intruded into our electoral system through our media, content that wouldn't have been there in the amounts that it was in had it not been for the Russians. And in many cases, wouldn't have been there at all because the nature of the content was that it was private content illegally gotten. It wasn't publicly disclosed through other means. So having defined the hackers, the trolls, the viral deception, and the imposter news, let me then lay in place a second set of assumptions. I study communication, and in the process, have to explain how it is that it could matter. And I'm going to make some assumptions about how it matters. Now, those assumptions are rooted in research. Some of it goes back as early as the 1940s in the United States. There's a reliable body of research across time that tells us two things that I'm going to rely on in my analysis. The first is that when you get imbalances in messaging, you get more messaging on one side than on the other, assuming the messaging is equally plausible, assuming each side is competent in communicating it. Those imbalances can create an advantage to the candidate who has more positive messaging or disadvantage the candidate about whom there's more negative messaging. Communication effects are not usually large. They're usually small. They usually occur on the margins, and they're usually short term. But when message imbalances occur and they're occurring close to the time that you're voting, they can have an impact on your vote. Not everybody's vote, not even most votes, but enough votes. Communication effects tend to be short term and on the margin to affect votes, particularly when early votes are being cast on a regular basis coming into an election. The content I'm going to look at occurred in the last 6 weeks of 2016 as early voting was taking place. So my first theoretical assumption is that message imbalances can create impacts on the margin in the short term. And what that means is if you can increase the amount of content you have in someone's social media feed, you might be able to affect them if that imbalance is sufficient to change them on the margin. Now, they'd have to be susceptible for that, but nonetheless, that's my assumption. My second is that when we vote, we don't think about everything that is at play in an election. We narrow to some considerations that matter to us. We all think that we look at everything and we carefully evaluate, but in fact, we think about some things more so than others. And those things that we feature as we're thinking about voting are shaping the factors that we consider when we're casting the vote. So if I can change what you think about as you're about to cast the vote, I can, on the margin, tip the likelihood that the candidate whose considerations are more at play, the considerations that advantage the candidate are more salient to you, that that candidate is going to get your vote. So if what the Russians are able to do is put things on the agenda or make them more central on the agenda through news or in social media, and as a result, narrow your considerations to include more things that disadvantage Hillary Clinton, they would have an effect, at least according to the theory and the background research that we've done across decades, on the margin with some voters as they're voting in the election. Now, what's important? That election was decided by 78,000 votes in 3 states. That's not very many. So having defined terms and set up my theoretical assumptions, I only need to make one more claim before starting into an analysis. And that is, most people just aren't susceptible to influence by communication in most campaigns. About 9 Republicans out of 10 are going to vote for the Republican candidate on average. About 9 out of 10 are going to vote for the Democrat if they say they're a Democratic Party affiliate. So if they say I'm a Republican, it's probably a Republican vote. If they say I'm a Democrat, it's probably a Democratic vote. People who aren't as tightly tied to a party are more persuasible. So that's a first premise about susceptibility. A second is that if you don't like either candidate, you're just really you just don't have a clear sense one over the other is better, you are in a situation in which I might be able to demobilize you. That is, just persuade you it's not worth voting. Or I might tip the balance even more against one candidate and thereby get a vote for the lesser of the two candidates, the candidate that you like a little bit more than the other, even though you don't like either one of them very much. And if you say you're still undecided as we come into the last days of the election, and you are not anchored to a political party, and you don't like either of the candidates, you're the potential target, whom in the short term could be influenced by imbalances in message and narrowing the considerations people are thinking about to feature more prominently those that advantage Donald Trump or disadvantage Hillary Clinton. So with that as the preface, the definitions, the theory, the argument of susceptibility, let me start by putting up the slides. I'm going to ask Gary if he would do that for me. So Gary is now going to share screens, and facts still matter. Across this lecture, I'm going to point to the facts that I think matter. So first slide. So we know that we still have the Russians who are out there. They're still engaging in aggressive interference operations, and they're still trying to stoke division in the country. Well, if the Russians stoked division in 2016, that's more likely to disadvantage Hillary Clinton because Barack Obama is president of the United States and Hillary Clinton is his heir apparent. One interesting question is, if they're stoking division in 2020 and Donald Trump is the incumbent, doesn't that create a disadvantage for Donald Trump, who might actually take the blame for the fact that the country has a lot of discord? That's just an open question. I'm not making an argument here, but I make the argument about 2016 that I think that did disadvantage Hillary Clinton because you'd had 8-year incumbent Barack Obama and a pretty clear heir apparent, Hillary Clinton, next. We know that there was a lot of Russian activity. So the trolls, these are the cyber warriors pretending to be us in social media, reached 126 million Americans, or may have. That means we don't know if they actually saw it and processed it, but at least they had exposure. And 1.4 million also on Twitter. So the first number is Facebook, the second Twitter. The hackers just deluged our poor journalists with 150,000 items stolen from the Democrats. And I'm going to argue the hacked content released through Julian Assange and WikiLeaks affected the media agenda to narrow the considerations in ways that disadvantaged Hillary Clinton. Next. We also have other kinds of activities. Many of you have a cable system at home that has RT on it. And if you don't know what RT is and you'd like to check to see if you've got Russians in your living room, go home tonight and search to see if you've got a channel that's called RT. RT is formerly Russia Today. It's the Russian propaganda arm of the current government. Basically, it's Vladimir Putin in your living room. Sputnik is also over-the-air communication, including radio, by the Russians, and it's in the United States ecosystem. I'm not going to focus much on it, but I want you to note that it's there and it actually has real reach into the US. The trolls, those are the cyber warriors. They're largely covert, where RT and Sputnik are overt. I can find RT and Sputnik really easily. Got to look hard to find trolls. The hackers were covert. They snuck in and grabbed the stuff illegally from those computers. The overt part of that was the release through Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And then a little piece I'm adding at the end because it's forecasting this year. The Russians didn't think Donald Trump was going to win in 2016, nor frankly did Donald Trump, nor did Hillary Clinton. The consensus was Hillary Clinton was going to win. And the Russians had in place a plan to delegitimize her presidency. They called it #DemocracyRIP, and it actually included some breaches of our election infrastructure. I'm going to talk about that in the last part of this lecture, which I'm just going to call And Beyond. Next slide, please. RT and Sputnik. Next. What you're seeing here is the kind of stuff you see with RT and Sputnik. This is the Russians talking to you. And what they're doing in the underslide, the Seth Rich slide, is arguing that it wasn't Russians who hacked and released the Democratic content. It was a young Democratic National Committee aide named Seth Rich, who was tragically killed early in the morning on a DC street. And one of the assumptions underlying this conspiracy narrative is that he was killed because he's the one who did the hack and release, and the Democrats weren't happy with him. So what you're seeing with RT is, and Sputnik, you're seeing efforts to rile discontent, but also to play through narratives that disadvantage the US and advantage the Russians. By the way, this is one channel that comes out against GMO technology and 5G, because one of the things that the Russians would like to do is to undermine technologies that are largely being developed in the United States, giving the US some competitive economic advantage. Next. The trolls. We tend to think about trolls as being in Facebook and being in Twitter, but they were all over the place. They were in every one of these sources, including right there on the bottom, there you've got RT. Next. And some troll accounts outperformed legitimate ones. So for example, the account that is mimicking Black Lives Matter, which is called Blacktivist, had more membership, more following than did Black Lives Matter, an important social movement inside the United States. The same was true at 10_GOP. 10 stands for Tennessee, and that account of supposed Tennessee Republicans, but actually Russian trolls in St. Petersburg, had more traffic than the actual Tennessee Republican account. Next. So let's look at some of the content. One of their themes clearly was just magnify fear of and opposition to cultural change. And I'm not going to read the slides. Some of them, frankly, are too vulgar for me to read them out loud. But what you can see is they're coming out on multiple sides of debates just simply to create clash and discontent. And in the process, they're pretending to be on alternative sides of these issues. They succeeded, by the way, in getting people on both sides to come to a number of rallies. And one in Texas, they urged them to bring their guns when they came to the rally. Now, it turned out to be a very small rally. It didn't have any real impact, but it's interesting that they accomplished that objective. You're also seeing the ways in which they're visually telegraphing things that elicit very strong emotion. And to the extent that people share before they've read and looked carefully, people may be sharing content that they wouldn't share if they had examined more closely. Next. I'm just going to let you read what's on the screen. So some of this is really strong content, and all of the posts I've just shown are highly problematic. They're turning us against each other. Why are they advantaged by that? Because if the United States looks bad in the eyes of the world, that advantages Putin and that advantages Russia. And if you can show lots of discontent inside the United States, that makes it look as if our system isn't a really desirable system. And so that advantages Putin's Russia as well. So what did the trolls do about the election? Up to this point, I've been talking about just roiling discontent and making us look bad. And that's been a Russian strategy as long as I've been around. I remember that strategy from the 50s and 60s. Well, first, they targeted voters of interest to Donald Trump. The first point at which I realized that there might be something serious going on here was that when I looked at the ads that were released in October and November, right after the election 2017, and realized that the ads actually had a theory of the election under them. They were trying to mobilize evangelicals and veterans. Those are groups Trump needs to win. They were trying to demobilize Black voters. That's a group that if it mobilizes up is going to advantage Hillary Clinton dramatically, because these are groups that if they vote are likely to vote one party or the other. Evangelicals and veterans, likely Republicans. Blacks, likely Democrats. And then they had a third move, which is shift young liberals and Sanders supporters over to Jill Stein. So if you have a coherent theory of the election, the likelihood that you could produce a difference goes up. This wasn't just scattershot, in other words. Next. So let's look at quickly how they sought to mobilize evangelicals and veterans. This is identifying an audience. Once you can identify the audience, that is, an audience begins to say, I like this, and starts to share it, you can use the lookalike function inside the platforms in order to identify the characteristics of the susceptible audience. And that's largely what this is doing. Some of this is just whimsical. You know, Satan, if I win, like if you want Jesus to win, what's that doing? It's trying to find those who identify with a certain form of Christianity, which you saw with the earlier posts about abortion, about protecting the Bible. Those are straightforward appeals to try to find white conservative Christians and white conservative Catholics. If you can find them, you know how to appeal to them. So that's a first move. Identify the audience and then model that, take that model of what that audience looks like and use that information to generate more content to reach more people like that. Next. Veterans. You're seeing the same kinds of appeals here. Try to find the veteran audience. Try to find the military household audience. And if you can find those audiences, again, you know how to appeal to them. You know how to locate an appeal. Then third. Next. Demobilizing Black voters. Next. No lives matter to Hillary Clinton, only votes matter to Hillary Clinton. That's a Blacktivist appeal. Next. The allegation that Bill Clinton fathered an illegitimate child with a Black prostitute. Next. And then disclaimed the child. These are simply mobilized up through pride. Next. And now we're beginning to demobilize. Next. Next. That was don't vote for the oppressor, and they're both oppressors. And now we're getting explicit appeals containing misinformation that is factually disputable. So we can make a direct claim here that this is demobilization because you can't text your vote. This is appropriation of images inside the US ecosystem, altering the visual overlays in order to say, you can vote from home, here's how you do it. Next slide. And the last move, try to shift to Jill Stein. Next slide. Choose peace, vote for Jill Stein. Trust me, it's not a wasted vote. The only way to take our country back is to stop voting for the corporations and banks that own us. That's a straight up appeal, straight out of the Jill Stein playbook. The Russians largely aren't creating new content. They're mimicking existing content. Next. If you search the RT and Sputnik archives, you find a lot of stories promoting Stein and the Green Party. And there's a reason. Stein and the Green Party under Stein are more hospitable to Russian objectives than are the other parties. So here's a reason to support the candidate, apart from trying to shift votes away from Hillary Clinton. So where's Jill Stein in this picture? This is the 10th anniversary of RT. You see Michael Flynn there. He's the one you probably saw in this picture before, because this is the picture you saw when he was indicted and then convicted. Oh, there's Vladimir Putin, but who's across the table? That's Jill Stein. Next slide. Now, so up to this point, we have the overt means, the trolls, the hackers. And next, we're going to turn to Democracy RIP. But before we turn to Democracy RIP, let me explain why it is that Donald Trump doesn't have the evangelical Protestant vote. He doesn't have the white Catholic vote in August of 2016. He needs to mobilize them up to the level that the Republicans traditionally get if he's going to have a chance in this election. And if you look at the statistics in August of 2016, they're not voting in anywhere near the proportions that Donald Trump needs. So why? Why not? I mean, why aren't they doing what you'd expect them to do? Well, Donald Trump just isn't a typical Republican candidate. 3 wives, vulgar statements about his own daughter, saying avoiding syphilis was his own Vietnam. And there are things there that are not appealing to Christian conservatives and white conservative Catholics. What about veterans? Same thing is true. If he's holding the percent in November that he was holding in August, he's not going to win the percent of military households he needs to just carry the Republican base up to the level it needs to get to a closely contested election. So why wouldn't those households be amenable? Well, multiple deferments, one for a transient bone spur, aspersions cast on a Gold Star family, saying John McCain isn't a hero. So he's got a problem as a candidate. When the Russians come in and increase the volume of rhetoric against Hillary Clinton for those constituencies to prompt people to vote against her and hence for him, they're helping perform a service his campaign needs to have provided. Now, the campaign is doing it as well, which makes it very difficult to disentangle effects. What about the shift to try to get the African-American vote demobilized? Hillary Clinton doesn't have to carry the black vote at Obama levels to win the Electoral College. She's going to win the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. She needs to just get it up to the historical average. And if she can get to the historical average, she's going to carry those three battleground states that decided the election: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But in 2016, the black vote is going to drop to a 20-year low. In effect, is going to be demobilized. Now, the Trump campaign is working to do that, but it's getting some help from the Russian trolls. So their electoral theory is sound, and they're meeting needs of Donald Trump. What about the attempt to shift the Sanders supporters over to Stein? Well, first, the Russians have done the Hillary Clinton campaign a huge disservice. They've really dealt her a blow by disclosing DNC, Democratic National Committee content that suggested the DNC had its thumb on the scales against Bernie Sanders. Some of that, by the way, isn't as clear as evidence that the news accounts might have made it out to be. And that broke at the Democratic convention, where there was real discord from the Sanders supporters, which made it more difficult for Hillary Clinton to consolidate her base. So some of the hacked content was also appealing to this group. But also, if you can get disaffected voters who might not like either candidate, but if they're going to vote inside a party structure to vote for the Democrat to shift to a third-party candidate, then Hillary Clinton is denied those votes. If the Stein vote from the previous election, she was the candidate in the previous general election, just holds at that proportionate level, and she doesn't get the increased vote that she gets 2012 to 2016, 2 out of 3 of the battleground states, assuming those votes go to Clinton, shift over into the Clinton column. So that's why those moves are important on behalf of the trolls. Hackers, next argument. Here I'm going to argue that the failures are the failures of our press. Reporters failed to source the hacked content to the Russians or to Julian Assange, who was their intermediary. And that's important because Julian Assange was on the record opposing the Clinton candidacy. So the press, first because of the press norm, which says you should source your content, should have told us illegally gotten by Russians. It should have also told us given to us by Julian Assange through WikiLeaks, importantly because Assange was opposing the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. They also downplayed or ignored the October 7th, 2016 confirmation the Russians were behind the hacking. And they failed to note the lack of independent verification of the hacked content. And as a result, gave it a legitimacy unwarranted by the content itself. Now, in retrospect, the content was never discredited. And as a result, it probably was accurate. But that doesn't change the press's obligation to tell us they hadn't independently verified it. And notice the importance of saying, source it to the Russians, source it to Julian Assange, say that you haven't independently verified it, indicated that it's illegally gotten. That's source information that voters might want to take into account as they judge the messages. They might want to ask, well, why would the Russians be intervening on one side? Why don't they like Hillary Clinton? And the answer is, Vladimir Putin has told us, he blames her for an uprising against him when he was running for election. And he blames the Obama administration for the release of the Panama Papers, which made him look bad by revealing his financial dealings and the fact that he holds a large amount of money outside the Soviet Union, very large amounts of money. So, but you wouldn't ask those questions if you weren't thinking, well, Russians did the hacking. And once you ask that, you might also want to ask, well, then, are they favoring Donald Trump or are they simply opposing Hillary Clinton? My sense is they were more so opposing Hillary Clinton on clear grounds. Whether they had reasons to favor Donald Trump or not, he was saying more positive things about what his foreign policy would be, that is positive to Vladimir Putin, than certainly was Hillary Clinton. There's another reason for featuring the fact that the press is not making it clear that they haven't independently verified, that they're not making it clear that this was hacked, illegally gotten. They're not being clear it was the Russians who did it, and Julian Assange was the intermediary. This matters because if a reporter would keep that top of mind, a reporter wouldn't engage in the same kinds of uncritical passing through of content that the reporters did in 2016, where they just simply didn't apply routine tests of newsworthiness. And next slide. And they took hacked content out of context. If they had Russians top of mind, they would have looked more carefully and they wouldn't have made those mistakes. And at key moments, they altered the media agenda and they took hacked content out of context. and that, I'm arguing, disadvantaged Hillary Clinton. Now, to this point, I'm simply making assertions to you. How do I know? Well, first, let's look at the headlines referencing WikiLeaks by outlet. Well, you're seeing Breitbart, you'd expect it there. You're seeing Daily Caller, you'd expect it there. Fox News is there, but look at where the Washington Post and New York Times are. WikiLeaks headlines, just in the headline. That doesn't count all the articles in which they were in the article and not in the headlines. You're seeing substantial trafficking during a time in which early votes are being cast. In fact, you're seeing it right up to Election Day. Next. And the Access Hollywood tape, which is released on October 7th, got some play, but the WikiLeaks released content, the Russian illegally got hacked Democratic content, got consistent play, and the searches for content were consistently higher for it than for the Access Hollywood tape. And the Russians accomplished something really important on October 7th because they released the Podesta hacked content on the day that the Access Hollywood tape appeared and on the day that our intelligence agencies had revealed it was the Russians behind the hacking. In the process of that strategically timed release, hacked content was released within an hour of the Access Hollywood tape breaking and that news story being posted by the Washington Post. They shifted the news agenda. The Russian hacked content confirmation of the intelligence agency dropped out of the news agenda. It dropped below the fold on newspapers the next day. It was out of the news agenda by Sunday. And instead of two stories damaging to Trump, the Russians are behind the hacking. And also, you've got the situation in which you've got Donald Trump's Access Hollywood tape. Now there was a counterbalanced narrative, and you have the hacked content. What did Hillary Clinton say in the speeches? On October 7th, I would argue the Russians saved the candidacy of Donald Trump. There was talk in the Republican high command of asking him to step down, moving Mike Pence up to the top of the ticket, moving Condoleezza Rice into the second slot. It was that serious. In the absence of that hacked content, would they have been able to make the decision to hold the Republican ticket as it was? I think there's a serious question about whether they would have been able to. Let's step back now. How did the press respond? The press after the election looked back and said the overhyped content of the coverage of the hacked emails was the media's worst mistake. This is David Leonhardt, New York Times. Next. Here's Amy Chozick writing in her book, Chasing Hillary. I didn't argue that it appeared the emails were stolen by a hostile foreign government, that it staged an attack on our electoral system. I didn't push to hold off on publishing them until we could have a less hairy discussion. I didn't raise the possibility that we'd become puppets in Putin's shadowy campaign. I chose the byline. Next. How else did the press respond? This is the Pulitzer Prize winning team from the New York Times. Every major publication, including the Times, published multiple stories citing the DNC and the Podesta emails posted by WikiLeaks, becoming a de facto instrument of Russian intelligence. That kind of press examination of its conduct in 2016 has decreased the likelihood that a hack and release in the last moments of a campaign will have the kind of impact on the media agenda that it was able to have in 2016. What have the platforms done? The platforms are now interdicting accounts on a regular basis. The platforms have changed their rules about how they're treating inauthentic content. And they've been shutting down accounts routinely from 2017 to the present. They've also changed their rules on advertising. You now can't effectively buy advertising from a foreign country. You can, but it's really, really difficult. And since the Russians bought some ads in rubles, you would think they would have figured that one out, platforms, in 2016. But now you need a US address. You need a verifiable ID number. There's a transaction back and forth inside the actual physical geographic US before they confirm that you are who you are. They've made it a lot harder to do that. And they've marked on YouTube content that is put out by government agencies or funded by government agencies. So RT carries a disclaimer, and so too does our PBS because it gets some government funding. So all of that has decreased the likelihood that we'll have a reprise of 2016, either on the troll front or on the hacking front, and that's all really good news. Let's look at one more instance that's problematic. Next slide. This is hacked content out of context. I'm now going to indict two really major reporters whom I admire greatly. I think these were inadvertent errors. Here's what was in the hacked content on October 7th, among other things. This is a paid secret Clinton speech. That's framing by WikiLeaks. To remind you, it wasn't revealed before. Hillary Clinton had been asked to reveal it by Bernie Sanders. She didn't reveal it. Hence, it was secret. They're reminding it was paid. She got a lot of money for those speeches. And that's potentially problematic because it raises the question, what's she getting for the money? So they're framing to remind you of two things that are problematic for Clinton. Look at what's quoted. You need to have a public position and a private position on policy. They're quoting that from a memo from a Clinton staffer that is trying to point out to the Clinton High Command how her statements from the speeches, her speeches, could be taken out of context and misinterpreted. The second, that my dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. Again, it's from a memo from the staffer, same staffer, trying to point out how content could be taken out of context. Next slide. What's the context? In the first instance, this is a speech excerpt that is speaking in the context of Lincoln's Spielberg film. Next slide. I'm showing you extended quotes so that you can see that. She's not saying to Wall Street banks, I'm going to overturn Dodd-Frank. I'm not going to enforce it. When in public, she's saying she's going to be tough on the banks and continue those policies. This is about her talking about politics in general, in the context of how Lincoln maneuvered to get what he needed to save the Union and get us through the Civil War. Next slide. And here's the statement at the end. So it's not, as the press construed it to be, an admission that she's secretly whispering alternative positions to people behind closed doors. Now, she is saying sometimes you need a public and private position, but it's not in the context of you need to be two-faced. But here's the question from Martha Raddatz in the second debate.
This question involves WikiLeaks' release of purported excerpts of Secretary Clinton's paid speeches, which she has refused to release, and one line in particular in which you, Secretary Clinton, purportedly say you need both a public and private position on certain issues. So, two from Virginia asks, is it okay for politicians to be two-faced? Is it acceptable for a politician to have a private stance on issues?
Now, first, when they coach Hillary Clinton, they should say, don't nod as people are reading things that are out of context. But set that aside for a moment. Hillary Clinton is going to respond, I was talking about Lincoln. This is the context. Donald Trump is then going to say now she's lying about Lincoln. By virtue of legitimizing the out of context statement that the press had started taking out of context as soon as the hacked content was being covered, that the morning of the second debate was being taken out of context in the morning Sunday news shows. By virtue of Martha Raddatz taking it out of context, she increases the likelihood that debate viewers who don't know any of that hear that as, of course, that must be what she said. That must be the context, because moderators are supposed to keep things in context. Disadvantage Hillary Clinton. Next slide. Now, this is the second excerpt. Now I'm talking about the Sunday shows, the 9th. So hacking released, the hack released content the 7th. Access Hollywood, the 7th. Russian confirmation the Russians are behind the hacking. By our intelligence agency's confirmation, the 7th. This is on the 9th, the Sunday shows. ABC kept it in context. My dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders sometime in the future, no comma, with energy that is as green and sustainable as we can get it, powering growth and opportunity for every person in the hemisphere. It's a dream, not a plan. It's future tense. It's sometime in the future, and it's talking about energy. There is no period in that sentence. Now let's look what happened on the other shows. A period appears on Face the Nation. Next slide. Ellipses appear on CNN. Next slide. And on Fox, you get ellipses, and then you get a statement that's 14 pages away in the speech. So by that Sunday, that speech segment is effectively taken out of context, and journalists aren't going to go back and ask what the context was, because they will assume that they've got it right. Next slide. So here's the third debate.
In a speech you gave to a Brazilian bank for which you were paid $225,000, we've learned from the WikiLeaks that you said this, and I want to quote, "My dream is a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders." So is that your dream, open borders?
Well,
she says, that's not what I said. I said sometime in the future, and I talked about energy. Donald Trump says now she's lying about what she said. The reason this is problematic for Hillary Clinton is that for Donald Trump, open borders is a digestive statement that capsulizes his indictments against Hillary Clinton. He is arguing she will let unlimited numbers of refugees in. She will let illegal, undocumented immigrants in large numbers. And she will have a completely open trade policy. Now, she's got vulnerabilities on trade because she changed her position on trade. But on open borders, she is saying, for practical purposes in the campaign, no, I don't stand for them. Once that hacked content is put forward, Donald Trump tweets and then says in speeches, see, all the fact checkers said she didn't stand for it, but here she is admitting in private that's actually what she's going to do. Why is it problematic? Next slide. When we compare debate viewers to non-viewers in the presence of controls, and we ask, how accurate is it to say that this candidate says one thing in public and something else in private? We see a statistically significant increase in the likelihood that debate viewers in the presence of controls will say Hillary Clinton says one thing in public, another in private. And when you agree with this statement, you're also predicting the increased likelihood you're going to say you're voting against her for president. So was this potentially consequential? Yes, it was potentially consequential. Next slide. So what have I argued? You've got a troll impact predicated on a theory of the election that was largely sound. You've got a hacking impact that is in the changing the media agenda and also altering what it is we think Hillary Clinton did and said. Now here's where fact comes to bear. Those troll posts that said you can text your vote, not true. Hillary Clinton out of context, not accurate. We need the full context. We need to control the factual underpinnings of our discourse in the presence of those forms of misinformation, disinformation. But what I argue in the second edition of Cyber War is, and what we learned between the first and second edition of Cyber War, because more data became available, there wasn't enough electorally relevant troll content that reached the likely target susceptible voters to have made a difference. But there was enough hacked content to affect votes on the margin as people were voting in early voting and coming up to the run up to the election itself. But that's not what the Russians thought was going to happen. Anyway, they didn't think they were going to help elect Donald Trump, which I argue in the book they did. They helped elect Donald Trump. They helped him through intermediaries, by the way. They helped it through people who, as a result, formed different impressions and then went out and vote. I'm not alleging they actually changed any votes, although we don't know that they didn't. But what's interesting here is, in addition to those overt measures, RT, those covert measures, trolls, the hack and release structures, there was a fourth piece to their plan. And now we've got something directly relevant to 2020. Apart from the fact that we've got our platforms more vigilant now than they were in 2016. That's relevant to 2020. We've got our journalists much more vigilant than they were in 2016. That's relevant to 2020. Now, what about the next 5 days? Well, what they were doing in 2016 was breaching our electoral infrastructure. And I know some of you study Russians and Russian propaganda. What do you think the likelihood is that the Russians were so clumsy that they left their fingerprints in our election infrastructure as they were trying to exfiltrate data? I think they left those fingerprints there so that they would be found, so that they could raise questions about whether the outcome was a fair outcome. What are we seeing right now? They penetrated part of the current electoral structure and we found them again. Were we intended to find them? I think so. I think it's part of a setup to claim that the electoral outcome is in question. Potentially there was some funny business going on. They also may have tried to place malware. If that's what they were trying to do, they failed. And they activated a troll campaign alleging voter irregularities and fraud. We've already seen some of that. And they insinuated sleeper personae alleging irregularities into mainstream news. Let's go back and look at these quickly. So FBI says election systems were targeted in 50 states. We knew that, which means they were caught in 50 states? Interesting. Where else are they other than the 2 places they've been found so far this year? Next slide. They tried to go and watch our voting booths. Now, this is, standard. U.S. sends people around the world to monitor elections. They wanted to come and monitor our elections in 2016. And I'm wondering if maybe that monitoring of elections wasn't an attempt to put some malware in. Now, you could just say, I have a suspicious nature. Yes, I do. But you can't really do much with our electoral count because we're so decentralized in the United States, unless you can get into the electronic tabulation system or the electronic transfer. And the way you do that is by planting malware someplace in a local system. That's just a hypothesis, and it's kind of a shaky one, but I wanted to throw that one out there for you. By the way, there aren't any Russians watching any polls that we know of in 2016. They also had troll accounts that had not been discovered as being illegitimate accounts, or in the parlance of the platforms, inauthentic, that were ready in the closing days. This is 18th of October, 25th of October, to tell us about the voting system malfunctioning. Vote rigging in process. Emily Baldwin, largely not talking about elections until we get close to the election, and now they're trafficking out claims about early ballots being tossed by election officials, things being rigged. Here's our friend at 10_GOP, the fake Tennessee Republicans. Next, another individual. Next, another individual. And we were seeing it this year in the form of Peace Data, which is a platform pretending to be news that was starting to traffic in those kinds of things, and anti-Biden content taken down by the platforms. And what's interesting about this is at 10_GOP, which mainstream news in 2016 was treating as a legitimate US account. We didn't know until 2017, those were Russian trolls, actually managed to get one of their tweets about election irregularities into mainstream news onto the NBC News site. What am I watching for on election night? Forward. RT and Sputnik putting out propaganda, social media activity, trolls with sleeper accounts, hacks and releases at the last moment. And so here's what we've got. RT and Sputnik have been at it ever since on attacking our economy. Next. Access to local airways through Sputnik. You've actually got them in Kansas with regular access. Next. Social media activity. We saw them in pro and anti-vaccination places arguing over a California initiative. They weren't there because they care about vaccination. They were there to build the identity of those troll accounts. So the pro-Trump trolls were trying to look more pro-Trump by being anti-vaccination. The pro-Democratic trolls were trying to look like they were pro-Democratic by being pro-vaccination. They were simply engaging in persona development. Here we see them hyping the coronavirus and Giuliani conspiracies. What are the Giuliani conspiracies about? Joe Biden up to no good in Ukraine. And they've tried to place opinion pieces in US media. They've tried to commandeer our journalists and aspiring journalists to write for fake news sites. Peace Data editors, solicited contributors, they've been taken down as a site. Next. And they're trying to spread a lot of disinformation about the coronavirus pandemic. So that's just rolling discontent. Next. They're also trying to help reelect Donald Trump. Next. They're denigrating Vice President Biden. Next. And they're trying to boost Trump's candidacy. And notice that's confirmed by our US intelligence agencies. They're arguing that Biden just has lost it mentally. They're magnifying crime and violence in the cities. They're saying mail-in voting is suspect. Next. What about hacking? We know they hacked in more places than we knew in the past in 2016. Next. And we know that in 2018, the US hacked back. So if we're asking what's going to happen as we run up to the last days of the election, I'm giving credit here to the Trump administration. It's the Trump administration that hacked back in 2018. So they shut down the IRA in 2018. The press broke the story early. It wasn't confirmed until the last couple of months when Donald Trump, as president, confirmed that it had happened. I'm assuming our cyber warriors in the United States plan to shut them down on probably the day before the election, and then on election day as well. We've already established that we can do it. So why would you do that? Well, you do that to try to minimize the likelihood that they're playing games inside our electoral structure. But notice what I'm arguing when I say that US did it, and they persisted. It did not of itself accomplish the objective of thwarting their continued activities. Now let me reprise for a moment. Barack Obama took action against them, shut down a number of their sites in the United States and threw a bunch of their diplomats out. The Congress, Republicans and Democrats, with a sufficiently large vote to override a veto, passed strong sanctions, and President Trump put them into effect. He signed the legislation. They were put into effect. And we hacked back in 2018, and we still have them here. Raises the question, what's it going to take to get rid of them? We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. You also have attempts to grab content out of a site that many of us are using to track the coronavirus. Next. And the threat persists. Next.
We would like to alert the public that we have identified that 2 foreign actors, Iran and Russia, have taken specific actions to influence public opinion relating to our elections. First, we have confirmed that some voter registration information has been obtained by Iran and separately by Russia. This data can be used by foreign actors to attempt to communicate false information to registered voters that they hope will cause confusion, sow chaos, and undermine your confidence in American democracy. If you receive an intimidating or manipulative email in your inbox, don't be alarmed and do not spread it.
Next. How much has the U.S. managed to block? We think a lot. Have we gotten it all? Probably not. Next. Facts still matter. It's important that those things that are trafficked in social media not be shared unless we can confirm the source and we're willing to stand behind the content. It's important that our journalists remember to honor their norms. It's important that the platforms remain vigilant. It's important that we learn the lesson of #democracy RIP so that the Russians or somebody else is after us in the next 5 days. We're there and we don't let them. I'd be happy to take your comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamieson, for a compelling talk. So we're now entering the Q&A portion of this event. Just to remind you that you can dash off questions in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But I would love to invite back Emily Fowler to get us started with the first question.
First off, I want to say thank you so much. That was so fascinating.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, my question is kind of two-pronged. So experts have found evidence that Russia has been conducting similar disinformation campaigns against most Western democratic states since the early 2000s, including with the Brexit vote back in 2017, most notably. And I was wondering if the United States can work with the EU or other international organizations to protect voters in 2024 and beyond, or will AI technology and hacker technology just continue to develop quicker than potential policy?
Yeah, you're really asking two different questions, and they're both important. This is always the state of the play is always changing, and the danger is we look back and we're fighting the past war instead of looking forward and catching what the changes are. We've got a really smart tech community. We've also got a very sophisticated cyber command capacity in the United States. So the likelihood that we will continue to stay ahead of the curve, if anybody can, is pretty high. As for cooperation with other democratic systems, the other democratic systems actually tried to provide us with protection. So we tend to think of this in terms of the US point of view, which is, of course, we have the best, we're the United States. But some of our information about what the Russians were doing came to us from other countries who had infiltrated with technology, the IRA headquarters. And actually, we're actually watching the Russian trolls engage in their activities. So is there informal sharing across the European nations, Britain and the United States about these matters? Yes, there is. And has that continued? Presumably so. You wouldn't want our United States Intelligence Agency to be telling us about all of this, but the evidence we have from what we have been able to see of our own actions would suggest that yes, it's there, and yes, it's being used dexterously. But it raises a larger question, which is, how would you get everyone to stand down? So the assumption of many of my students, at least, is, well, of course, the US doesn't do those sorts of things. That's just them doing it to us. And that's simply not true. The US has interfered in elections around the globe. The US has done things that many of us would consider unsavory, and many things that we certainly would not want done to us. And so the question becomes, if we wanted to stop this from happening, is there a treaty structure that we could put in place where we all agree to stand down? And the reason it's related to your question is, could there be an agreement among the democratic systems that the Soviets, that Iran, that people outside that sphere would buy into, in which we would agree that an attack on one is an attack on all? And could we put in place a penalty structure that is so high, with everybody agreeing to stand down, we're not going to do it, that we would discourage it from happening in the future? That we'd still have to be vigilant, but that I think would be desirable. And I hope that goes on to the table sometime more quickly than it has. I'm surprised that it hasn't at this point, but the international community is in such disarray because of all of the changes inside of US foreign policy as we switch from one administration to another, that it may not have been possible to get that to the table. But I think it should be looked at seriously. Secondly, there's a piece of legislation that's gone nowhere, but has bipartisan sponsorship that would set up a structure by which if someone, let's say Russia, interferes in a US election, that the immediate set of preset responses would be activated as soon as it was verified, that are horrifically strong, really stringent economic sanctions. And they couldn't be taken down by an incumbent president. They would have to stay there through 2 election cycles with no other intervention, with no other interference. And that's basically create a warning structure that's so scary that no one will step over the tripwire. I like that idea because if you manage to elect a US president, the US president couldn't take the penalty structure down. And so I think there are things in the offing if the globe can settle down, once we get out of the pandemic where the crisis is just coping. There may be some things that we can do to settle all of this down and take at least this piece of dysfunction, not just off our table, but off the table of the Western nations, as well as Russia, Iran, et cetera, who really don't want us meddling in their elections any more than we want them meddling in ours.
Okay, we have a really impressive queue of questions. I will try to get as many of them in as I can. So the first question is whether you could delve more narrowly into which demographic groups are the most susceptible to this kind of targeting. Is there, do you have any sense in terms of your research in terms of whether particular education, age, other demographic qualities make someone much more susceptible than others?
Yeah, the individuals who are most likely to be affected are those that are open to having their vote changed, who don't have a firm voting decision. So, a whole lot of this, and I'm only talking now about electoral effect, because increasing our extremism is an effect, and it's a problematic effect. Normalizing extreme discourse, hence normalizing discourse that makes it harder for us to be a community, is problematic. It's just not an electoral effect. But determining where the susceptible voters are, and there are 2 different arguments here. One is they're voters whose vote can be shifted from one place to another. That is, they haven't really decided. But there's a second argument layered into this book, which is there are voters you can mobilize or demobilize. And the voters that you can mobilize are those who just aren't that happy with your candidate. But if you can make them dislike the opposing candidate enough and make that candidate seem threatening enough, you can still get you to vote the way you would vote if you were going to vote. So the change is not in how your mind has changed. The change is whether or not you act on your disposition to stay within your party. So who is most likely to be susceptible? Those who are demobilized. They don't really like their party's candidate. And that you can demobilize. You can also, in that situation, you can demobilize them or you can mobilize them. So why didn't the African-American community naturally support Hillary Clinton? She's got that super predator statement in her background. Now, Joe Biden never said super predators, contrary to the statement by Donald Trump at the debate, but Hillary Clinton did. It wasn't a statement explicitly about Black individuals, but it was about gangs in a context in which it's plausible to think that someone might hear that. She also was carrying the legacy of the Bill Clinton, and you could say also Joe Biden, crime reforms and prison reforms that increased the level of incarceration rate within the Black community. So she's carrying that legacy in, and that legacy is problematic, which means there's some reason that you don't start out in that community being all that excited about casting that vote. So the likelihood that you're going to get your impact out of the people who could be demobilized or mobilized because they're not that excited about their candidate, or who just can't decide which because they don't really like either. They're not anchored to party, and hence they're still undecided late in the election. That's the place you're going to get your influence. Now, that said, we all think we're not vulnerable to sharing misinformation that we get. So there's a phenomenon which is called the third person effect, where you always attribute the bad thing out. Other people believe that, but of course, people like me don't. And what I can say with confidence, and I'm an elderly woman, and we've studied for a very long time, is people like me, that is educated individuals who think of themselves as well-read, et cetera, are subject to all the same human biases as everybody else. And we have to work to counteract our biases too. So, you know, the likelihood that we're less critical of information that's consistent with our predispositions, I don't know of any evidence that says we're any less likely. I think being generally wary about material that you can't adequately source is a good rule for all of us.
Mm-hmm. So we're all vulnerable in a key way. Okay.
And we're vulnerable to having our considerations narrowed to things that become salient because we see more of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if repetition increases the likelihood that you think something's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and that's part of the way this imbalance works. You hear it, you hear it, you hear it, you hear it, you see it, you see it, you see it, but also you're narrowing to get that inside your field of vision as you're deciding for whom to vote. And there's no reason to think that those of us who are more educated are able to see the whole world and in a neutral fashion weigh everything equally and appropriately. You know, we're subject to.
Very helpful, thanks. So I have another question here about what is the impact of news deserts, where there is no independent press or just the shell of an independent press? And how do we fix or adjust for this problem in the future? And the questioner wants you to know that Eugene stands out to this questioner as one of those places that has a news desert.
Yeah, this is a crisis. One of the things that the Russian trolls did, and I have a piece that I sometimes try to push into this lecture because I like it so much. The Russians managed to set up local news sites throughout 2016. They're little community news sites. They attracted people. And for the whole election, they just picked up all sorts of local stuff in the community. They were vigilant about grabbing stuff on social media. They looked like your friendly neighborhood news site. They were actually providing a service that looked like a little local community newspaper had arisen right in the middle of your little area in rural America. And then as we got closer to the election, they started posting problematic content. So they were there lurking as an imposter news site. And if you don't have local news that can police other things that pretend to be local news and write an article or post a piece that says, who are these people? We don't know that they're owned by anybody. We don't know any of these reporters, where they come from. You know, could this be disinformation? You're more vulnerable to having your news desert filled with Russian trolls who are creating an imposter site, and then at the last minute use it to traffic out misinformation. And this is a year in which we're really subject to misinformation because we've got COVID. We're all hunkering down at home. At least those my age are certainly hunkering down at home. And you suppose at the last minute you hear, oh, somebody showed up without a mask who was coughing and had to be taken to the hospital at your polling place. Do you go and vote? So, you know, beware the local news sites. And what I've been saying as I've been talking to journalists is every place that still has a local press, please scan your environment to see, is there any presence there online that you don't recognize that's been performing what looks like a community news function? Can you just find a human who's behind that, who's in your community, please? Because if you can't, you may be finding Russians or Iranians or fill in the blanks.
So our next question is, what is the Russian role, if any, in disseminating the Hunter Biden stories at this point in the current campaign?
That's a really good question, and the answer is we don't know. And one of the reasons the platforms are being so careful, one of the reasons that mainstream news is being so careful is that this is so close to the election. And the chain of custody about the alleged Hunter Biden laptop and the sources of the alleged content on it passes through the hands of known partisans who, according to our intelligence agency in the form of Rudy Giuliani, have been the object of a Russian disinformation campaign. And so there's a lot of controversy about why hasn't that story broken out of the conservative ecosystem. And my colleague Joe Capella and I wrote a book a long time ago called Echo Chamber, Rush Limbaugh and the Conservative Media Establishment. That was the first major extended analysis of the ways in which Rush Limbaugh and the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal were beginning to create, with Fox News, informational enclaves in which the sense of what the reality was and the factual base of it were differing from the enclaves into which the other parts of the population were placed. And what we've seen is that tendency is just magnified now that we've got social media. And conservatives are more likely to stay inside that enclave structure than are moderates and liberals. Doesn't mean there isn't an enclaving structure in the other places, but there's a greater tendency there. So if you've been in that ecosphere, you've gotten a lot of information about it, some of it problematic information. If you're in the others, you're just bewildered because you haven't gotten very much, which means that when we got to the debate, when Donald Trump raised the attack, a whole lot of people said, what is he talking about? And a whole other block of people knew exactly because they were inside an ecosystem in which it had been discussed at great length. And presumptions created about the legitimacy that I can't independently verify. I founded factcheck.org with Brooks Jackson. We made the decision to write about it, which was a controversial decision. We wrote about it early. We wrote about what had been put forward as emails. No one's ever been able to check the metadata to see if they're real. But we wrote about it, said, let's assume for the moment, and said, there's really no news here. What's in that part of this publicly disclosed was all out there during the impeachment inquiry. And the investigations there, including by Republicans, did not find that Joe Biden had engaged in illegal activity. He simply had carried out the policy, not simply of the US, but of our European allies and Great Britain. So we wrote that way. Now, that means there's a whole block of alleged stuff on that supposed laptop we have not touched. At some point, somebody is going to get their hands on that, verify whose it was, check the metadata, and be able to figure this out. We as a journalistic community, now let me speak in my fact check, we don't know the answers to that. Someone presumably does. And there are all sorts of other questions about if the FBI does, why shouldn't it tell us? Well, the FBI wasn't supposed to be telling us anything about anything in 2016. Made two statements about Hillary Clinton that were problematic. Didn't make any statements about Donald Trump. I think they did the right thing, by the way, no statements about Donald Trump. They did the wrong thing about Hillary Clinton. They've been chastened. They're not going to say anything. So whatever you think of, the next layers up at the Justice Department, not beginning to intervene in an election with information that you've gotten under these circumstances, I would argue is a good decision for the FBI, not a bad decision.
Okay, thank you. So our next question comes from Ellen Peters.
Oh, hi, Ellen.
And Ellen asks the following. You mentioned the affect heuristic and viral deception. I'm curious about your thoughts about another but failed application of the affect heuristic. Why did negative effect not attach to Trump among evangelicals given his actions? One argument could be that the distribution of viral deception, as in WikiLeaks, distracted them. But why didn't negative affect attach to Trump in the meantime?
That's a really good question. And I think this is the answer. I think the answer is it did. But negative affect attached more strongly to Hillary Clinton. And as a result, the higher level of negative affect for Hillary Clinton created the imbalance in affect that let them cast the vote that their disposition to be Republicans dictated. And secondly, that even as they said, I don't like him personally, I don't approve of him, his character, I don't approve of him morally, They said he's released his list of Supreme Court nominees. They are pro-life and they are conservative. They will protect what I believe as, now we're talking from their perspective, an evangelical Christian, a white conservative Catholic, ought to be the position of the court. Roe ought to be overturned. He is saying he's going to protect my religious liberties, etc. And I believe what they did was they voted the issues and not the character. So I think the negative affect did attach. I think it attached more strongly to Hillary Clinton, where the trolls' efforts were not to disassociate it from Trump. It was to attach it more strongly to Hillary Clinton, and that they held their nose and voted on issues. And by the way, we've always said campaigning forecasts governance. The public never believes this. The public thinks they pander all the time. Public's thought this for decades. Campaigning forecasts governance. Donald Trump tried to do everything that he promised that constituency, right down the line. So is that constituency now with him because he kept his promises? Do they like him any better as a moral character? Our survey research would suggest they still find his moral character problematic.
So we have the next question is related to Facebook. How do we confirm the source of a post on Facebook if it is a meme? I think I have inadvertently shared a couple of left-leaning ones you showed us. So confession time.
Yeah, I had the interesting experience when I was going around talking about the first edition of Cyber War, to have people stand up in the audience and say, oh, I read your book, I saw those pictures, because the book has a lot of pictures in it of content. And I shared that, or, my grandfather shared that, or, I got that, and I thought that was really funny, so I shared it, and I just didn't think it was a problem. I mean, one question is, some of this content, the purpose of them getting the content to you is to profile you, so that they can find other people like you. And the content on the face of it isn't actually problematic. I mean, some of it's just whimsical. The problem is once they figure out how to appeal, they then expand into attaching hate to the content, attaching disgust to the content, and then marginalizing other parts of our society and trying to get you to get into a we-they frame about them. So I wasn't worried when people said, well, I shared, Hillary Clinton fighting with Satan. I thought that was just funny. I worry if they shared, stop burqa invaders. And so but the idea that people would say, oh, I did it. And the problem is, if you don't know the source of something, I assume you shouldn't share. They just don't do it. The minute you do, you become the source. And now your friends are sharing because they trust you. So is there a reliable way to know? Not really. I mean, you could do a whole lot of backtracking to try to figure out where the origin stream is. If you're really good at computer searching, but it's really time consuming. Probably when in doubt, doubt.
Okay. So we have a question about Iran that relates to the press conference you were showing. It seems counterintuitive that the Iranians would be trying to help Trump in this election. Is that credible?
Yeah, that's the reason I cut the clip so that statement by Radcliffe was not there. Because I analyze text. So I don't know what's inside people's heads. But I can look at text. And if I looked at who received those messages, Democrats, what did the messages do? Threatened Democrats. On behalf of whom? Proud Boys. I wouldn't start out by saying, I assume that that's, to hurt Donald Trump and benefit Joe Biden. So, but do I take it at its face because the head of the FBI stood next to Radcliffe and didn't rebut the fact of it, but he didn't confirm any of that allegation about who was intended to be benefited or not. So, I don't think that's a plausible reading of the text. And you could say then it was meant to be disclosed, and when disclosed, people would say, oh, that must be Donald Trump, et cetera. So you could kind of go through a set of iterations, and it's possible it could have both objectives, but the answer is we're not inside their heads, so we don't know what they were trying to do. On the face of it, it looked to me like they were trying to intimidate Democratic voters. And
Great.
you have people who went in news, by the way, and said that they were frightened by it, that they were. So you watch their faces as they talk to the news people about how they felt when they got it, and they look like they were frightened by it. So that being frightened by it doesn't look to me like, that's hurting Donald Trump. And how many of them were frightened by it and decided they weren't going to vote?
So speaking of foreign interference, our next question deals with not just states that are engaged in it, but those who choose not to. So the next question is, are Russia and Iran the only states engaged in viral deception in US elections? If yes, what keeps other states from participating? If no, how do we account for the focus on Iran?
Well, China has interfered in the past. And one of the early intelligence reports also swept in China. China's the one who hacked in 2008. Foreign countries with intelligence services do try to get into our system. The difference between earlier years and 16 was that they were trying to gather intelligence to find out what the candidate would do as president. They weren't trying to disclose the content. So when the intelligence agencies first saw the moves in 2008, which is the first year I saw it tracked aggressively, they simply made the assumption that that's what it was. They were just simply looking to find out, well, if each candidate is elected, because you had two non-incumbent candidates. You have McCain against Obama. So the reasonable assumption up to 2016 was it's just intelligence gathering. And the assumption is everybody who's got the capacity tries to do that, and that we do it too. The question is, what would the decision about taking the risk of hacking and releasing? Why were they willing to take the risk? And I believe the Russians were willing to take the risk because they knew they could launder through Julian Assange. And Julian Assange was credible because our news organizations had partnered with him over many, many other disclosures of information that, frankly, I like to see in public domain. I mean, I like the Guantanamo information that Julian Assange WikiLeaks broke open. I mean, I like to know when the government's up to no good and somebody decides to post it. So the journalists actually trusted Assange, and they trusted WikiLeaks. The Russians would not have gotten away with this had the press not trusted WikiLeaks and Assange. And Assange in the past had provided the whole tranche of information. There's some exceptions to that. One of it is ClimateGate moves. He put it out selectively. But in general, they got the whole tranche. In general, journalists got time to look at it and vet it and make sure that it passed newsworthy tests. This was a kind of new move for Assange, and it caught, I think, our journalists unaware. And although some of them were suspicious of Assange, and they all knew he'd come out against Hillary Clinton, I think they lost track of it. And when the Democrats didn't dispute the content, I think they made the assumption of accuracy, lost track of the fact that Julian Assange was selectively dropping content opportunistically. And we don't know what he wasn't dropping, but he was dropping it at the moments to do maximum disadvantage. And he was framing it in ways designed to increase the likelihood that it was going to be used in certain kinds of ways. And I think the press level of susceptibility was high because of the past relationships. I don't think that susceptibility is there in any other way with anyone else. I think just that simple fact is off the table. So why would someone not do it now? Because you're not going to get away with it to the same extent. Frankly, the other reason is because our journalists just aren't as susceptible.
We have another question that is interested in Russian interaction with social media influencers and celebrities to target young voters, whether that's happening and whether you can speak to that in some fashion.
If it's happening, it hasn't been identified by the platforms. And at this point, because they've got the technical capacity, and there are some other players in the United States and in other major research operations. There's a wonderful operation working out of Oxford in England. My capacity, my staff capacity isn't such that we follow that. But if that's happening, it hasn't been flagged by the platforms and shut down. So I am assuming that it is not. But remember that everybody is innovating. So what are we going to learn when we look back? Remember, at this time in 2016, we didn't know the trolls were there. And by the way, there's a completely separate argument in the book. And those of you who are interested in the book, get the book in second edition, not first. The second edition has been completely rewritten to update the content and came back out this summer. There's a completely separate argument that Russian disinformation was planted to create influence inside the FBI, and I argue influenced James Comey's decision to castigate Clinton in public when he said they weren't going to indict her in summer, and to make public the reopened investigation of the Wiener laptop. And that second decision by Comey demonstrably affected the news agenda in ways that demonstrably dropped the polls very clearly, attributable solely to it. If I'm correct that he made that decision based on Russian disinformation, that he knew was false, but he also knew would be believed by our press and believed in polarized times by enough of the electorate to be seen as plausible, hence discredit of President Clinton and or discredit the FBI, then the Russians, again, through an indirect path of influence, influenced a decision by someone whose decision that affected the media agenda, that affected the polling, that affected the votes, that affected the media coverage, that affected the votes in the final 10 days of the election. And the argument is just too difficult and nuanced to try to put into a brief presentation. But I keep making bets with my friends. I'm an elderly woman. I don't know that I'm going to ever live to see it. At some point, someone's going to confirm that, yes, Comey was in fact influenced by what he knew was Russian disinformation. But in a polarized environment, believed if they dropped it through Julian Assange, the media would treat it as legitimate. It would be believed by at least half the country. It would delegitimize Clinton and it would delegitimize the FBI. And as a result, he made the Wiener laptop investigation public, believing she was going to win anyway. And as a result, he wasn't going to affect the outcome. And in the process, he did affect the outcome.
Yeah. Another colleague, Regina Lawrence, has a question for you.
Oh, hi, Regina. It's so nice to know that you're there.
Her question is on behalf of a number of her students. She says, you think really carefully about words. Have you thought about the labeling of this effort as, in quotes, Russian? Is there a more precise term we could use that wouldn't seem to impugn Russian people in general?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. The problem is it's a complex operation. So it's not just one part of the Russian establishment that is doing it. And when you start to specify the sub players, people just fog over. I thought at one point of calling it Putin. But for practical purpose, Putin is the Russian state, at least in my analysis of it. But at one point, the title of the book had Putin in the title instead of Russian trolls and hackers, how Putin's trolls and hackers. So I grant that, yes, they're using a national characterization is not the most apt way to express it. It's just my failure as a communicator to find a way to telegraph it clearly enough to select one of the alternatives.
So our next question relates to your title and is asking, we seem to be in a situation where we don't agree on what the facts are. For example, the impeachment trial of Donald Trump, and the facts don't interpret themselves. Can you help us out with this?
Well, the question is there still something that is knowable? So can we grant that you and I, as independent human beings who disagree ideologically about something, could still look at something and get down to something that would let us ground an argument from which we could move because we grant a shared perception? And there are days in which I actually doubt that. So the virtually everything is now challenged. And I know some of you are rhetoric students. So just a side comment to the rhetoric students. I mean, for practical purposes, Sextus Empiricus argued that you could end any argument by constantly challenging the first premise of the argument and constantly challenging any evidence that was offered as untrustworthy, because you can drive into eternal regress. So you can never ground the argument. You never find a place to start. And one of the problems with a polarized perception of the world is we've lost our ability to ground in something that we can argue is factual. We can stipulate as factual for purposes of continuing the discussion. It's making it all very, very difficult for people to govern. Factcheck.org is predicated on the notion that there is a knowable if you specify your definitions carefully enough, if you're setting up context clearly enough, and if you're open to the possibility that you're wrong. But I think when I named it factcheck.org, I made a mistake. I think I should have called it context.org because for practical purposes, most of the time, we're not adjudicating things that are tightly factual in the sense that there's an externally verifiable thing that a neutral observer would be able to specify. It's not the world that you live in. The language is primed and framed. There's a frame around the way in which it's cast. And as a result, and it's out of a context. The question is, where do you draw the boundaries of the context? Most of the time, what factcheck.org is doing is context placing. And it's saying, we want to give you the context in which we see this as being set. So that from that, and then stipulating these definitions of what we can know out there, this is not representing what we can see of the knowable real that is there. And on some things, the reason this matters is if you say that the unemployment rate is really 46%, or you say the unemployment rate is really 6%, you have different policies that are appropriate. So it would help to come to a common definition of what you think you mean by unemployment, specify it to the electorate, and then tie your economics understandings back to those kinds of definitions. Because sometimes what you've got is it's very convenient to find the alternative definition to lodge your argument in a different place. But for practical purposes, there's no real disagreement about what the real is out there or about what the reasonable policy response to it is. It's just convenient to select one other data stream rather than another to provide the interpretive frame.
Well, I have dozens of more questions, but we have reached 5:30. So Dr. Jamieson, we can't thank you enough for an incredibly enlightening past 90 minutes. It's flown by. And so thank you so much. And to everyone who's been able to beam in for this, we're glad you could. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.